welcome back to It's an Inside Job podcast. I'm your host, Jason Lim. Now, this podcast is dedicated to helping you to help yourself and others to become more mentally and emotionally resilient so you can be better at bouncing back from life's inevitable setbacks. Now, on It's an Inside Job, we decode the science and stories of resilience into practical advice, skills, and strategies that you can use to impact your life and those around you. Now, with that said, let's slip into the stream. Well, welcome back to the show in a fresh new week. Thank you for allowing me to be part of that week. Back in April, I was invited to be part of a discussion panel with 3 other guests and a moderator at the SHE conference in Oslo, where we spoke about personal and organizational resilience. Now, 2 of my fellow panelists were people that were on this podcast earlier this year. And if you are a regular listener to this podcast, you'll probably recognize 2 of those guests. The first was Tove Selnes. She is the Chief People Officer of Storebrand, and her episode was Season 3, Episode 2. I also had the privilege to share the stage with Bård Fien. He is the guru of psychological safety. And we recorded our episode in Season 3, Episode 15. Well, why am I mentioning this? Well, the moderator of that panel discussion on organizational and individual resilience was an amazing person that I met, Anniken Fjelberg, and she is the guest of today's podcast. And so who is Anniken? Well, Anniken Fjelberg is passionate about collaboration for innovation. She's an experienced leader, entrepreneur, and advisor with extensive experience from various sectors for over 25 years in Norway and internationally. Anniken is a strategist with broad expertise ranging from branding and communication to innovation and sustainability. And she's been investing in the startup scene for the past 10 years as co-founder of one of Norway's largest tech hubs, 657 Oslo. She holds positions in several boards of directors. She's also a renowned speaker, consultant, facilitator for companies and organizations throughout her consultancy, Identio. Well, let's now welcome Anniken to the show and slip into the stream and learn more about who she is and what she does. Well, a big welcome to you, Anniken. I'm glad we were able to find this time where we could shift the conversation from the stage at SHE conference to this podcast format, just you and I. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I was wondering, maybe we could begin our conversation by you introducing who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. So my name is Anniken. I am Norwegian, live in Oslo. And as a profession, I have been working with branding for almost 30 years, but I've developed my field of competency and strategy work to include much more. So today I say that I work with facilitating complex strategy processes for companies, and that varies from really large corporations to startups. I'm also a serial entrepreneur, so I've started and led a couple of agencies, branding agencies, design agencies, and also back in 2012, I was part of establishing one of Norway's first entrepreneurial hubs called 657 Oslo, which is basically a co-working space for creative tech companies. Today we have 3,500 square meters downtown Oslo. It's a really fun and vibrant place to work. So I feel really lucky to have been able to have a journey like that, while also working with my clients, of course. So basically, I also sit in a lot of boards and councils and have a lot of variation in my work life. So on a personal basis, I'm married to Joachim, my co-founder. Mm-hmm. And together we have 4 children that are not really children anymore. They are 17, 19, 20, and 23. So life has been pretty hectic the past 10 years. Yeah.
Well, we had the fortune to meet at the SHE conference here in Oslo in April. And, I think we just kind of connected on different levels. And as you clearly know, this podcast is about sharing stories and experience of resilience. And as a serial entrepreneur, I'm sure you've had your fair share of challenges and adversities that you've had to come through. I was wondering, maybe we could sort of rewind back to maybe earlier in your career. Maybe you could talk about a little about some of the challenges and the adversities you faced as a young professional coming up through the game.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on because when I started working back in 1994, after I took my education, the world was very different than it is today. I was almost I just got a cell phone, right? And I remember I was well into my career before I got an email, and Facebook was like in a distant future. So back then, I had no intention of being an entrepreneur. I grew up in a family setting where both my parents worked in the same companies all their career, like large companies with a lot of opportunities and changes. So great careers, but I did not see that coming for me. So the reason why I became an entrepreneur was basically because I fell in love with the subject of branding, because it came in the 90s to Norway, and I was part of the first wave of branding consultants, and I was really good at it. And with that came some opportunities. So I was asked to start a company within a communications group. I declined the first proposal. That was from Leo Burnett at the time, because I was pregnant, which I would never have done today, of course, but back then I did. And then the second time around, where I was asked to start a company in Dynamo Group, I said yes. I thought, this is the second time. I thought I'd never do that, but here we go. And I have just never looked back. That was in 2001. I was 31 years old. I had a daughter. She was turning 2 that year. And it was challenging for me, because I sort of jumped into it without really knowing what it would look like. But I have come to really love building companies and also being my own boss with everything that comes with it.
Yeah. And, as you said, building brands, I think that's a lot of part of when we look at companies, and we're going to be talking about resilience and such. I think, having a strong identity is definitely part of that separates you from the crowd. And things get shaken up. Like a brand, for me, it can take a long time to build up the trust and credibility in the public sphere. But sometimes it can take one momentary lapse of reason to destroy that credibility. And so I can understand why what you do is so intricate to a company, and it's so valuable, because credibility, identity, I think they go hand in hand. What are some of the unique challenges that you see that companies face at the moment when it comes to?
Well, there are so many challenges right now that I don't know where to start, because you have the whole value chain issue with especially companies that have, a retail presence or are producing something. Business is just forever changed, it seems, with the first pandemic and then the war in Europe. But of course, if you talk about branding as such, reputation has a lot to do with it. And today, the demands that customers and clients and partners and stakeholders will have to a brand or a company is very, it's more complex than it used to be. We're more aware and more knowledgeable, as also even consumers today are more knowledgeable about, what they look for when it comes to the ethics and the behavior of companies and brands. So, for instance, right now, there is a lot of companies struggling with the green shift, becoming sustainable enough for the Green Deal and everything going on in the EU for with regulations and packages of framework that you need to relate to as a company. And of course, there are trends, huge trends with consumer shifts in what we eat, how we consume, what we buy. We have the whole sharing economy where we want to rent things instead of owning them. Clothing need to be circular, and all of these things happen at the same time. And how we consume media is also to a great extent influencing our behavior. And I think we've just only seen like the very tip of the iceberg when it comes to AI and how that will change the way we consume media, the way we produce content, the way we relate to one another, build brands, and understand the world. So it's to be positive, it's a very exciting time to be alive. It requires a lot of responsibility for all of us, or from all of us, to be paying attention to which changes are benefiting the whole of society and which are not. And let's hope we can control those who are not.
Again, it comes down to perception. For me, between, as you said, the green shift and the greenwashing. And I think that's a very fine line, so that it sounds, for me as a consumer or as someone who sits outside of corporations looking at corporations, there's a difference between what is deep and sincere and what seems to be just superficial and just a facade. And I think a lot of that comes back down to the genuine actions that they take and how those actions play out. And as you said, we're just at the tip of the iceberg and how it plays out. What would be some suggestions or advice, you as a serial entrepreneur and working in such an ecosystem, what kind of suggestions would you give to them in order to create a more resilient brand or more resilient company?
Well, that is a really good question, and it's a big one because there are so many things one can do. I think what we do in 657 Oslo to provide some sort of frame in itself is providing the foundation for building resilience, because you need to be able to lean in on something. When you are vulnerable, you want to have something that can support you. You can very well do so yourself if you have the tools. So I'm not saying you're depending on other people or other companies, but I think being in a supportive environment, whether you're a startup or a person, individual, or both, I think is really beneficial. So I think finding your community where you can get support and also give support is one factor that will be a smart move when you're an entrepreneur to build resilience. What you will also find in a community is a network. And the network will by far extend the physical community you are in, at least when you're part of an entrepreneurial hub like us. And what we see is that we all share network. If I have a coworker building a company within green tech, for instance, I will be more than happy to introduce that team to my investor friends, for instance, because I know them and I can vouch for them. That will, of course, be very valuable to that startup. And that will also go the other way around if there is anything their network can do for me. So it's sort of this mutual sharing space that not only will build resilience, but also give a lot of opportunity. And what I normally say to startups is that remember to build your support network in happy times, in good times, because it's when you're down, you're going to need it. But it's very hard to build a support system when you're down, especially when you're especially when you are an entrepreneur, because investors, for instance, they are being chased by, especially nowadays, many, many startups and scale-ups because money is scarce today. And so you're not going to spend a lot of time without getting anything back with a startup you don't know. But if you build a relationship with that startup over time and you find them interesting, fundraising takes time. So you may have a dialogue with the startup for maybe half a year before you decide to invest, or before the startup decides that you are the right investor. And then if the shit should hit the fan after half a year, you're in a much better position to want to reach out and pull some strings or help that particular team. So I think, to build your resilient structure, to label it in good times, is very important.
And what I hear is that if you're going to harvest, you need to be planting seeds 6, 8, 12 months earlier than that. And as you said, it's building your network, building your support, building your credibility, creating a community around you so people understand who you are. As you said, you're a serial entrepreneur, and I'd like to get more personal with you in a minute, but I'd like to still deal with the ecosystem of our conversation right now, talking about startups themselves. There may be a lot of founders, a lot of startups listeners listening to this, and they're struggling right now because of just the economic and financial times and all the constraints that are hovering around us right now. And they're kind of getting down, and they're ruminating, they're overthinking. What advice would you give someone who is facing a lot of adversities and is actually feeling quite overwhelmed right now?
Yeah, well, I see it, play out every day because we've been through a pandemic, with these 250 people sitting in our offices, and that's just us. Then you have the whole ecosystem. So after that, and then the war, and then the financial instability we're experiencing right now, this is sort of becoming like the new normal. And so what I find is that those who are the most resilient right now are those who are willing to take a good hard look at their business model to see if they need to pivot to meet these new frames that we are all living in. That could look like, changing your payment model. It could mean changing your team, could be downscaling, could be merging with your competitor. It could be just, how to put it, like slowing business down to just hold it while you wait for better times if there is no other option. Or it could actually be to accept that you go bankrupt and move on. There are so many alternatives. And for me personally, we were very, very unsure that we would be able to stay afloat with 657 during the pandemic, because basically we have a resilient business. We have a thriving business, and we have a thriving community. But our business model is, based on the fact that we don't own these two buildings. So we are renting 3,500 square meters downtown Oslo, and we are depending on our coworkers paying their monthly rent to us, so we can pay our monthly rent to our landlord. Now, during the pandemic, obviously, all these startups, they had to move home and work from home because they weren't allowed to be in a community like ours. And we, of course, went into negotiations with the owners of our buildings, and they, of course, also were in a tough spot. Everybody was. And we were, for a couple of months during April and May of 2020, very unsure how this would play out for us. So we established 3 scenarios. One scenario was that we were able to work with the ecosystem and find some way of funding us through this pandemic somehow. The second scenario was that someone would come and benefit from this occasion and buy us cheap, or that we would go bankrupt. And we weren't planning for bankruptcy, but we were reading up on it because we haven't experienced that before. So we needed to understand what that would look like so that we could be prepared for that scenario, because that has consequences. We thought it would be very unlikely that someone would acquire us in that situation, but we did have a few talks, even though it seemed strange. And we would then go for number 1, which was to be able to find money to survive, while we were preparing also for number 3. As it turns out, we reached out to our ecosystem where we had given value into that very same ecosystem for 10 years. And it paid back. So we, together with other hubs like us, Mesh and Startup Norway, etc., we were able to apply for funding from Innovation Norway and Oslo municipality and others to be able to carry out projects that would benefit entrepreneurs during the pandemic, which would also, of course, be income for us while we did it. So through that arrangement from the government, we all actually survived the pandemic. So that's what I mean in being agile enough to rethink what you're doing and find new ways of running business when life is changing.
If I may challenge you a little, when you get to that point, when you're able to make decisions and be decisive to pivot, to look at the reality of bankruptcy or finding other solutions, reaching out to your community, you have to be of a certain state of mind to do that. But a lot of people, when they're faced with overwhelming adversity and challenges, we can sometimes freeze up, we can choke up, and we can kind of procrastinate and do everything else but deal with the situation. If I was to challenge you, Anniken, you got to that point where you saw things drying up, you saw, people leaving the space and going home, and back in April 20. Before you got to that place, before you and your partner got to that place and decided, okay, we need to get things in order. Yourself, how was your psychology? Were you shaken, or because of your experience, you were able to bounce back relatively fast to get into that decisive mode?
Oh, I love the question, because the thing is, I have been part of this once before, because I also ran my own business as a 37-year-old with 25 employees back in 2007, when the first financial crisis of my career really hit. And so I knew already that my knee-jerk reaction to a crisis is to act. We're all born with a certain character and personality, and we can always change, but we have something in our personality. Either we created it or we just had it from before. And my basement is really just desiring to act when there is a crisis. So when there is a crisis, I always act very rapidly. So I knew very quickly during the pandemic that we need to give our staff intermediate leave of absence. So I also knew how that worked, and I knew how I needed to follow up the employees in order for them to feel safe. So we did that immediately. So cutting costs was just right there. And I think that's also part of the leader responsibility in a situation like that not only do you need to manage yourself, you need to manage your business, but you also need to manage your people, even though they're not there. So we had like a double challenge with the absence of our staff. One was that they did not have their job to go to, and that their payment would come from NAV for a few weeks or even months. The other thing that was that everyone was scared by a pandemic. And as an employer, you are responsible for your employees and their psychological safety. So it was challenging, and I was I was glad that I was a grown-up. I mean, I'm 53 years old today, and I was over 50 when the pandemic came. So I had a lot of experience, and I used all of it, Jason, all of it. If I had been 21, an entrepreneur with a team of 6 of my own age, it would have been so much harder. So I think that, being able to lean into myself was very like a privilege that I had this time around. But I can tell you that back in 2007, it wasn't as easy. I had a lot of fear attacks back then. What you said about freezing up, that was, so my counteract to that would be to act. But I know now that it's also sometimes good to just pause a little bit before you act. Take a couple of deep breaths, reflect a little bit, speak with someone wiser and maybe a bit calmer in the situation to get some sparring. So when it comes to those emotional reactions that those kind of situations will stir up in us, my personal experience is that the amount of fear that I would experience as a newly divorced single mom of two very small children, entrepreneur with the responsibility of 25 people in a very male-dominated environment in the communications industry back in, the early 2000s.
Are we looking like 2007 here? You're talking about?
Yeah, 2006, 2007. Yeah. That was a handful. That was an emotional handful, and fear really ran me for a while back then.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of explore that mindset in a moment. As you said, now in 2020, you have a fundamental character trait where in a crisis you kind of automatically go into decisive mode and start making decisions. And maybe some of those are really hard decisions to make, but you have to make them as you said, to take care of your people, their well-being, their mental welfare, their psychological safety. And that requires you to be decisive. And one of the things you said was I had to lean into myself. Was that something you learned, or is this part of the fundamental makeup of your personality?
No,
and what do you mean by leaning into yourself?
Yes, thank you. No, that is not something I was born with. That's something I've learned through my life, through experience. And it's just recently I can call it what it is, leaning in on me. But as you grow older, and this is comforting when you're younger. If I'd known this, I would maybe, been more patient, maybe. But when you experience life, and life takes you for a ride now and then, and it does with everyone. For me, it's been it's been going through a divorce. It's been being a single mom. It's been losing my father quite early. It's been 2 financial crises before I was 40 with a company that I was also very much responsible for. Letting go of safety when I quit that job and jumped into the unknown, becoming an entrepreneur again, this time with my new husband, and learning how to build a business together while we were building a family, and all the risk involved. All of those, I would say 20 years has proven to me that I'm not going to die from this. I'm still here. I've experienced things like these before. And we women, we have a huge advantage. We give birth to people. And we know also something through that about resilience and physical pain. And that life and death sometimes feel very present at once, or simultaneously. And that gives you like a couple of extra gears or shifts, when things are blowing in your life. And I think that's why I said earlier that, having experience is such a gift when you are a leader and things become a bit rough. And yes, I said that I have this, personality trait of acting when there is a crisis. But I must say that today, what I did during the pandemic was more planning. So yes, I did the cost cutting right away because I knew that my main responsibility is the long-term well-being of my staff, which means keeping my company alive. Mm-hmm. So then the resilience of the company is the ultimate goal. And within the plans and decisions we make in that aspect, the primary next thing is taking care of the people. But I mean, if you take too good care of the people, you may lose the company. So there is this balance that you need to be making. And sometimes that will put you in some hard situations where you need to have some difficult conversations. Mm. But then that's your job as a leader. Mm.
Mm. So leaning into yourself, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, part of that makeup is to draw on experience. As you said, experience is the gift, but we need to be able to draw the lessons from that experience, whether they're successes so we can repeat those successes, or whether they're flops or mishaps that we learn from that. And I think that's a very important point, because what I understand is from a cognitive perspective, there's something I always talk about: gain versus loss, or lack, gain versus lack. And a lot of us can be so fixated on the future and what we lack that, we're constantly focused on the outcome. An outcome can shift. We can't see all the variables in play. It's impossible. And so the outcome can shift on the horizon. But what I hear you're saying is, I looked over my shoulder from the trailhead of your experience from 20 years ago to where you are now, or to where you were when you were speaking, is that you can look at that. When you look over your shoulder from the trailhead up to where you've gone, it's the successes, the failures, the hills, the valleys. No one can take that away from you, because that is your track record. That is factual. Anything ahead of you, well, that's an unpainted canvas. And so I think what you're saying is that experience is the gift, and you can draw from your experience. And then you can see, I've been through worse, or there's been something like this. And as you said, the ability to give birth and to understand the duality of that pain and that pleasure, of that of light and dark, of death and life, what have you. Also, what I hear part of that leaning in, as you said, it's the gain versus the lack or experiences, but it's also reflecting on different scenarios, maybe using metaphors or reflecting on different experiences to kind of add vibrancy and to actually help you to understand what is the true significance, so you don't blow it up too much, but you don't reduce it too much. And there was a third point that I've lost it, but that's what I understand what leaning into. Oh, yes. You said also to talk to someone, because you get lost in your subjective storm. But by talking to someone, what it sounds like, and please correct me again, when you're talking about your challenges, your adversities, your thoughts around something, obviously you're trying to articulate to them your internal environment, your thoughts and your emotions around it. But was it also that you actually heard yourself out loud when talking to them to help you find objectivity?
I think it's a good summary that you're making. And I think the last point is really interesting, because what I was reflecting on when you were back sharing to me what you heard is that to be a bit personal, one of the things my mother said to me in her speech to me at my 40th party, which is now like soon 14 years ago, she said, I think of you when I read that quote from Thor Heyerdahl, the Kon-Tiki adventure, when he said, I know that there exists, boundaries and limits to things, but I just can't see them. And she's always, my mother, been, questioning, why are you choosing to do this? Why are you choosing to do that? Not always understanding my choices. Because I do sometimes take the longer route to a goal. I think I am, as a person, very interested in experiencing different things. I'm not linear, and my career is a zigzag career. I'm not a branding consultant only anymore. I do other things now, and I started an entrepreneurial hub together with my husband, and I have been doing very different things than the people that I went to school with, for instance. And so what I'm fascinated about by many entrepreneurs that I meet and that I, talk with, either because I meet them at 657 or if they ask me to mentor them or whatever it is that some of them are so good at asking for advice, and they know what to ask for. And they actually lean in on other people's experience, and they are able to draw wisdom from that and avoid the same pitfalls. And I'm not sure that I have been very good at that. I have needed to experience both the successes and the pitfalls, So I think that moving forward, that's basically something that I want to also practice more, because I've been inspired by people that are building scalable tech companies that they've never done before. And it's a funding journey when you need to fund your, basically cover your expenses up front before you make any money. And then you need to have, a really compelling story and get people on board before you can actually prove your value. And just, talking with people over and over and over again to shorten the journey, to accelerate the speed, and to gain the trust, and to be able to prove your value. That's really, really fascinating to me. And I'm very impressed with people who are able to learn from other people's mistakes and successes. That is a really great way to be building your business.
In part one, Anniken emphasizes that having a supportive environment and community is vital for entrepreneurs, particularly when they are facing tough times or feeling vulnerable. She believes that it's essential to find something or someone that can provide support during difficult times. According to Anniken, creating a mutually beneficial sharing space within a community is an effective way to build connections and networks that can extend one's reach. Anniken stresses the importance of building a network during good times because it can be invaluable resource during tough times. And that's when money is scarce. Entrepreneurs can turn to their networks for support, whether it's to find new clients or to collaborate on projects. She advises entrepreneurs to invest in relationships during good times and to focus on building their reputation, credibility, and connections. When asked about what advice she would give to someone feeling overwhelmed, Anniken recommends taking a pause and to talking to someone who has distance and is calmer. It's crucial to take a step back and assess the situation before making any decisions. Anniken also suggests being willing to take a hard look at the business model to see if it needs to pivot. This can involve changing a pay model, merging with another company, changing the team, or slowing the business down into a holding pattern. Finally, Anniken shares her personal experience of walking a rough road and learning to lean into herself. She believes that hard times do not have to be detrimental and that she has learned to see experiences as a gift. Anniken prioritizes planning and believes that the resilience and survival of her company is and will always be the ultimate goal. She also emphasizes that the importance of balancing taking care of her people and taking care of the company, as they are both essential for success. So now let's slip back into the stream into part two in this fascinating conversation with Anniken Fjelberg. So would you say leaning in is, if we could we also characterize it as an entrepreneurial mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. Scale up people that are actually thriving when they build company after company that has this hockey stick exponential growth. They have a special mindset. They don't see limits. They are very resilient in the way that they're like the dandelion flower that will grow through asphalt. It's just, they just don't give up. And I think it would be very understandable if they did give up at some point, because it's a very tough journey.
Yeah, I think it takes a certain mindset to strive after something and to build something from scratch and then try to bring people on board to move it forward. I mean, there's a lot of hurdles, and I guess you see that every day, if not every week.
Yeah.
So if we go back, try to understand this entrepreneurial mindset, this leaning into yourself. From your things, is to learn from your experience, to see experience as a good teacher, whether it's a hard experience or an easy experience, is to learn from that. What I also hear as part of that is to be able to look over your shoulder sometimes and to see how far you've come and how far you've grown and developed, and not always worry about the outcome, to focus on the effort, because sometimes the outcome is so far out that it's too hard to see. It's just a blur on the horizon. But the effort's where I hear. What you've also heard is that some of the other entrepreneurs you've worked with is that they have this ability to ask questions, to articulate questions, and to learn from others' experiences. So hopefully they don't have to fall into the same rabbit holes or pitfalls. And as you said, they see no limits. They just constantly want to keep pushing forward. They have a sort of an explorer type of mentality, right? That's part of the playbook. Was there anything else into this sort of lean in principle or mindset that we haven't captured?
There is one thing that I think is at the core of the whole leaning in thing, which is trust. So when I say that I lean in on myself, it means I trust myself. And if you have fundamental trust in yourself, that's very, very powerful, because then you are basically never alone. You always have yourself, which again makes you more resilient, because you have some support in all situations. And that also goes to trusting other people. So in order to feel psychologically safe, having the opportunity and also the ability to trust other people, I think is really, really important. And as a leader, your job is to establish that trust. I don't believe that's solely the leader's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility in a team to be trustable and to be trusting. And I think when you are working in a harsh environment, whether it is an industry which is crumbling, or it's a startup environment, or I don't know, politics, that's also a harsh environment. Or if you are a negotiator in the national negotiations between the laborers and the employers. I mean, there are so many places in society where you will feel like you're in the middle of a storm. If you can create collaboration or, some sort of trust, even though we disagree, you have come such a far way. The greater whole will benefit from that kind of attitude. And I think that's part of the responsibility that we need to take as individuals in the society today, and also as leaders. Because without trust, we will have accelerated conflict, both in small teams and in the large society. So that's something that's close to my heart.
I think one of the things that really struck me is when it's the fundamental trust in yourself, you said. From my experience, and of course, I'm coming from an anecdotal, working with a number of clients, trust externally, to build trust with other people is one thing. But what I hear time and time again is that it's so hard to trust myself. And you can see that because sometimes there's no compassion when it comes to, or there's no self-compassion to someone. They lash and whip themselves with self-doubt and self-critical thoughts. From your experience, if you had to share advice for young people come up in the game, or anyone in the game, how do you build trust in yourself? How do you build that, if I may call it, that confidence, that sense of self-esteem?
Yes, I love the way you also bring in self-compassion, which I think is very important to get that self-confidence. You also speak about in your wisdom, you share this ace up your sleeve with the self-awareness and self-compassion and efficacy. And I think the self-compassion is probably the thing that was hardest for me personally. I had like a deficit of that early on in my career. And actually, there are many advices. There is not one quick fix for this, but I would, because I love it myself, I would get a therapist or at least a coach. More than a mentor. A mentor's job is more situational, but a coach can guide you, in your career, also in your personal life. If you get a therapist, you are able to work on a deeper level with the root cause of why you have the reaction patterns that you're having. And so I went to a therapist when I was like in my early 30s. Actually, I started in my 20s, but I got really, hardcore into it when I was in my 30s. And I would use my time in the car, because I drove for a long time to get to work every day. I would use that time to practice. And at one point, after I was getting into the habit of being self-aware, like questioning, am I breathing now? Am I crunching my jaw? Am I like biting my lip? What am I doing that I'm unconscious about? Then I would notice how I didn't trust myself. I would get these fear attacks with, did I remember to do that? Or did I make a fool of myself in that situation, or whatever? And I started contradicting my inner voice by saying out loud, every time I recognized that contraction within me, I said, you can trust yourself. And I said it like 10 times in a row. If it came back to me 10 times in a row internally, I would go, you can trust yourself. You can trust yourself. And I did it for so many months That's actually, even today, if I get that, oh, did I remember to? We all do that now and then. It comes automatically in my head. You can trust yourself.
Yeah.
So I've sort of made a track in my brain where that's just the automatic reply. And, our brains, and you're the expert here when it comes to the brain, Jason, that most of us, after having read Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, we know that we have a reptile brain, and we have a neocortex, the new brain. And the reptile brain is quick, survival mode, like you said earlier, freeze and fight and flight. While neocortex is much wiser and much more intelligent, and where we build relationship and also trust. And so the easiest advice I can give to anyone is, if you are in your reactivity mode, being down in the reptile brain, breathe. Breathe 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. Like, take the time, even if you're on stage in front of 2,000 people, like you and I were the other day, just take that time to breathe.
Yeah.
And look at, the situation, access your neocortex, give it time to get started, and then you will, tap into your intelligence and use your knowingness.
So what I hear is you use self-compassion. So over years, you've practiced the sense of, the emotion comes up. You realize that you can't stop the emotion. But then when that emotion arises in you, you ask yourself, what do I want to do with that emotion? And obviously, you tend to move more towards the reflective decision than more the reactive, or as you called it, more of sort of the emotional decision, just reacting. But instead, you take the long road, you said, and you're more reflective. You ponder and you question what this emotion is. And then what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you make a decision based on what you're emotionally, you look at the information of the emotion and then make a more cognitive decision as to what you want to do with that emotion. Is that what I understand?
Yes, or I would maybe put it a different way. I will not be reactive when I make important decisions. If you are reactive in my book, it means that you are coming from a state of emotions, meaning that you may be angry or afraid or some sort of, reactive response to a situation, which will limit your capacity to see, various outcomes. So I think it's important to recognize that you have emotions about something. Being a leader in the middle of a reorganizing of a company with maybe even thousands of employees, I would not know how that is, but I've done it for, people are people. I've had 25 employees that I needed to deal with in a really hard situation as a young person. That's tough enough. And it has always been beneficial to me to learn to not react in the moment, but just take a little time. It doesn't have to be days even. It can be hours, but to be smart about taking a decision, not being reactive about it. That has led to different decisions in my career, at least, also in my personal life. And I didn't always do that. So I know that has been a wise decision to learn to take a few breaths before I jump into a decision in a situation that is emotionally challenging.
And to take that breath, or take a deeper breath, that you need to obviously be conscious. That's a conscious choice. Okay, I feel myself reacting. I need to breathe, to settle down, to be more reflective. And over time, you said you've just developed this really good habit, and it triggers automatically. But if we rewind back and someone's saying, okay, that sounds easy enough, but it sounds so difficult. And usually what I see is when someone's at the crossroads where they can either just go reactive or they can go reflective, the brain tends to choose the reactive because the threat they see is a tiger, and it may only be a paper tiger, right? But at that crossroads, how can someone be more self-aware? How can someone be more conscious to make that choice to take the reflective road, which is sometimes a steep climb, and it's easier just to go down with gravity down to the reactive road. But how can someone begin to develop that? How can they make themselves self-aware from your experience?
Well, first, I think you need to want it. And the reason why I want it is because I think most of us who have been reactive and acted upon it in our lives, we've had some regrets. Sometimes when you are acting on your reaction, you may hurt people, you may make a foolish decision, and you will always pay for that later at some point, at least in my life. And that has led me to want to not do that again. So having that wish in the bottom of everything, or that want, the desire not to experience suffering from my own reactivity, has been a motivation for me. So if that is in place, it's about awareness, exactly the way you say it. Then you need to recognize the situation. And for me, I trained myself in recognizing when I had an inner contraction, like when we are angry or scared or uncomfortable or irritated, whatever kind of reaction we're having, big or small, you can notice it in your body. So for me, I would notice that I would contract in my belly, and then I would stop breathing. And after a while of practicing being aware of what's going on in my physical body, I would, as you said earlier, immediately recognize the situation. And then I would automatically start breathing. And then I would cognitively know what I was doing. Like, okay, I'm having a reaction. I started breathing intuitively. So I need to look at the situation. What's going on here? And then it's about having tools. And then choosing among those tools.
Can you speak more? I think that was quite fascinating where you're talking about contraction. And contraction is sort of this embodied cognition where you actually feel that things are sort of enclosing. So before, in our pre-meeting, you talked about expansion and contraction, these skills that you've learned. I was wondering, for our listeners, could you sort of articulate or explain a little more of how you understand it and how that helps you move through crazy days, crazy weeks?
Yeah. So I'm laughing because I when I grew up, I'm a busy bee. I like being, all over the place, and I still am. So, I talk about this, and yes, I have had an evolution as a human being. But I'm still, working on this, obviously. So those two, I won't call them skills, but those two tools that you mentioned, the ability to recognize contraction from expansion, is talking to the state of mind or the state of awareness or the body state that you're in a situation. And I had grown up learning myself that I loved stress. So if I had adrenaline, I felt happy. It took some de-learning to figure out that, actually I don't love stress. It's not what makes me happy. I was just addicted to it. And actually it made me very unhappy. And it turned out that it made the people around me unhappy as well. One of my employees at one point said to me when I was in my early 30s, he said, "You know what? I love working with you. I learned so much. I think you're just fun and we're achieving so much here. But sometimes I feel like we're all water skiing behind the boat that you're driving. And at some point, we may have all fallen down and we're all struggling, holding on to the rope with our mouths full of water. And you're not turning around. You're not seeing where we're at, So that was a metaphor that it really got me to think, that was,
That's a great metaphor. It's so
oh
visual.
My God, I felt so bad when he said that. And those kind of learnings, I've had thanks to the people around me. So I believe that, first of all, you need to take in feedback and be open to receive it. And then, of course, because I started seeing a therapist, and I even also had a coach because I found that to be two different things. I wanted to learn how to detect and become aware of when I got that addiction to stress chasing me again. And the best tool for me was to recognize when my body would go into this adrenaline state. And you get adrenaline through, exercising your body and through going on stage, being very excited about it, maybe a bit nervous. It's not bad to have a physical contraction in your body. It's just a, reaction to something going on. But I wanted to learn how to choose when that was a good thing and when it was, let's call it a bad thing, when I didn't want it. And that was the work I had to do. And my therapist was good in guiding me to see the option. And the option is actually being in a state of expansion. When you are feeling safe, when you're feeling loved, or even when you feel loving, when you are excited, when you're happy, there is this other way of being that is, for me, what I now call true happiness and true excitement that doesn't come from adrenaline or toxic stress. So giving myself the opportunity to practice, feeling, so this is what it feels like when I have an expansive feeling. And the funny part with having an expansiveness in my body is that it's actually goes beyond the body, is my experience. And those of you who do yoga or meditation will know what I'm talking about. And being able to sustain that expansion actually was hard work for me. It was much easier for me to contract and hold the contraction than to expand and stay with the expansion. And I believe, practice makes perfect, or perfect is not existing, but practice makes you better at what you want to achieve. So I actually named my holding company when I stopped working in Dynamo and went solo for a few years. I called my company Keep Expanding, because that is my mantra. I want to remember that I want to keep expanding. Yeah.
I've never thought about it. I think it was so eloquent what you said, the contrast between expansion and contraction. I have never thought about it like that, but it seems so natural to me. Because contraction, as you said, it can be sort of more of a negative stress, as you said. So it can produce anxiety or that adrenaline cortisol kick. But then you said expansion is also when you feel excited. The reason why I want to touch base, because I think that's so fascinating, because if I got a doctor to say, hey, and to put you in an MRI machine and to measure what you're feeling. So you have increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, core temperatures going up. And then I'd ask the doctor, what's Anniken feeling right now? Well, I don't know what she's feeling, but I can tell her physiological reactions. Then I pull you out of the machine and say, Anniken, what are you feeling right now? Well, here's the thing. You could say anxiety, you could say excitement, because both states have identical physiological markers. What makes the difference between an anxious state and an excited state, even though they're identical, is the story we tell ourselves. And so when you're excited, you feel expansion. And then you said something along the lines, I feel more than myself. There's something beyond that. Just to connect something else to this, I don't know how relevant it is, but it's just more of a curiosity from my side. We have the two hemispheres, and it's not like the 1980s where the left is logical and the right's creative. That's completely debunked.
You're talking about the brain.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm talking about the brain. So the left hemisphere, it's very individual. It sees differences in things. It categorizes, organizes, prioritizes. It sees the difference between you and me. But the right hemisphere, when it's activated, it sees sort of the big picture. It makes connections. When I look out the studio window, the right hemisphere just sees the view. The left hemisphere sees the tree, the fjord, the mountains. And so what's interesting is when you said in the sense of expansion, more than likely it sounds like you're in an excited state, but your right hemisphere is more activated, where you start seeing the connections between something, where you feel part of something bigger than just yourself. And the left, when it's in a contraction state, it's a little more defensive. It's guarding. It's more of in a protective, anxious state, and it sees the difference or sees the threats. Now, I don't know if this is 100%, but this is kind of the connections my brain is making to what you've just told me. So I just kind of wanted to add to that. I thought it was fascinating. I really like that contraction and expansion states.
I think it's a good way to put it, Jason. So I completely agree with you. And I think talking about entrepreneurs, like we did earlier, they, I think, have a tendency to go right brain, right? They will see the opportunities. So maybe we have tendencies to go left or right. But for my part, it has been about befriending insecurity. And after I started the company Keep Expanding, that became sort of my mantra at the time. I quickly realized that starting 2 new companies in 2012, I was saying hello to that same old fear again, you know? And then I had my experience from my previous job and journey that made me reflect on, you know, what is this fear about? And I realized, you know, this is probably more of an excitement. I'm just of old habit thinking that it's dangerous. So I started, and I often do this, I started creating a talk, foredrag, a speech about that state. So I called that talk Seek Discomfort. And that became my second mantra. And I only have those two when it comes to my career. Keep expanding and seek discomfort. I really love them because they made me have a shift in my consciousness about what kind of the challenge I was having when I was having that, you know, worry, anxiety, fear, you know, call it what you will. But of course, I still have contractions, you know, in my emotional system. But then I can more like look at them and think, you know, why is this happening and what is it? And sometimes it's just because, you know, if you're going on a stage in front of 2,000 people, or if you're doing something for the first time, or if you're going to give someone a message that, you know, you're anxious about giving, it's only natural that you have a discomfort reaction. But it may not be all bad. You know, it's actually something that will grow you as a human being. You will learn something, or you will solve a problem, or you will be so happy afterwards. You know, there are so many reasons for that to be a right brain opportunity, or a right hemisphere opportunity, or something that you intellectually, with your neocortex, can tell yourself that, yeah, sure, Anniken, I notice that there is a contraction here now. But that's okay because we want to do this. This is good. Yes, that's excitement. So yeah, positive self-talk when you are not stable in that state yet is very good, I find, in those situations.
You know, I just want to rewind back because I think you said something very significant, and I just want to put a sort of a kind of dog ear this part of the conversation. You said you have a mantra of seek discomfort, keep expanding. And just for the listeners to understand that this mantra, as you call it, is also a reframe. You know, our brains are storytelling machines. And I've mentioned this a number of times on the podcast, but if I ask you, Anniken, what you did before we met on the podcast, you tell me a story. And the brain tries to make sense of the world by creating a story and putting it into context of self. And so what I want, you know, and those stories can only be sometimes 2 or 3 sentences. But if you're constantly telling yourself, seek discomfort, keep expanding, and those thoughts are not just positive affirmations that are sort of superficial, but these are based on your experience. And as you said before, you looked over your shoulder, you learn from your experience because that's fact. That's what you've accomplished, good or bad. That's accomplished and it shaped you. And the mantra, as you framed it, that becomes your reframe. That becomes the story you tell yourself every time you move into a challenging situation. And it's the same thing. If I'm constantly telling myself, oh, you're so stupid, oh, you're so incompetent, and I keep telling myself that layers, and that's going to affect me emotionally. And so what I wanted to just say is what you've done is it's simple, but there's a deep, profound elegance to it where you're repeating just 2 sentences to yourself all the time. And that shifts you from contraction to expansion, from anxiety to excitement. Even though they're identical physiological states, what changes is what you're telling yourself. It's the narrative or the meaning you're ascribing to the current situation you're facing. And I just wanted to put a cap on, I just wanted to kind of bookmark that because I think it's so I think it's profound. And it comes back to what you've said earlier about this leaning into yourself or the entrepreneurial mindset. It's all connected. We've just put different labels on them. Mm. I just wanted to say that because I thought for me that really hit home.
Yeah, no, but that's cool, and I agree. It has been very, very profoundly changing, my life basically. So I couldn't agree more. And I think, those kind of mantras. I really believe in the power of having mantras and also changing them throughout your life. You will sometimes have integrated the mantra completely, and then you can give yourself a new challenge. But for those of you knowing what NLP is, neuro-linguistic programming, that is very powerful. That's part of, what this is about. And I really do believe that there is no real change in my behavior and my understanding of my life without a deeper understanding than just reprogramming my brain. So I took a coaching education at one point to have some leader tools. And I chose to not go the NLP route because I wanted what they call coactive coaching, which means go deeper, understand the root cause. And I don't think I would have been able to formulate those mantras and to be as wise about it as I was back then without having done the work with where does my reactivity come from. And I just want to add that to what you're saying, because I do believe you need to do the work.
It is. If you want to become stronger, more flexible, have greater endurance, it's all about the work. If you want to learn a language, well, you need to put in the work. And I think this is the same mechanism. I'd like to shift the conversation. So you're 53 years old now, a lot of experience, serial entrepreneur and such. And then early in the conversation, you talked about when you were 37 years old, the financial crisis just hit us, 2007, 2008. You were responsible for 25 people heading a company. As you said, at that point, you're going through a divorce. You were a single mom. There was the financial crisis, of course, as I've already mentioned.
Yeah, my father passed away.
Your father passed away.
It was a lot of challenges. Yeah.
So if the 53-year-old woman could go back to that 37-year-old, considering the perfect storm that it was, what advice would you give to her?
I think, that kind of question is so hard for me, Jason, because it's not I don't work that way, or my body doesn't work that way. My brain doesn't work that way. I almost don't know how to respond because I think I did what I could. So I did exactly what I could do. And then there is no need or use for me second guessing what I did. I think that I was faced with the same kind of challenges in another wrapping during the pandemic. And then I saw how I did it differently, but I would never have been able to do it that way in 2007. So in a way, it's easy to say that, I should have created scenarios and I should have meditated more, or I should have, this and that. Maybe even I should have sold my house and had less debt to have less stress, but I didn't. And today I'm glad I didn't. So I'm sort of happy that I did what I did, but I have chosen a path in my career and life that has created a lot of challenges and pressure over time. And that has also got me to where I am today, which I'm glad for, so.
If we shifted, okay, let's shift. I think that's very important because all the experiences have led up to the success and who you are today. If we shifted the question slightly, then as a woman who has a professional career, who's well respected within the community, what advice would you give to a young woman who may be a single mom, who has a leadership role, who is dealing with aging parents, and everything else that's pulling at her. She may be, let's say, early to mid 30s.
That made it much easier, Jason.
Yeah,
let's talk about
there.
Somebody else. No, you know what? Actually, my metaphor for that is put on your own oxygen mask before helping other people. It's the airplane metaphor. And I think especially women with small children, we become so obsessed with helping everybody else before we take care of ourselves. That's the only advice I would give. I think everyone has the resources they need to fix the situation they're in, to live a good life. But you need to take care of yourself. And what that looks like is completely individual. I can say that I didn't do that well enough, that I would have done differently. And that would have, looked like reducing the amount of activity that I was having, going on at the time. And when I do mentoring for instance, female entrepreneurs in their 30s, that is part of that conversation. What do you do for you? How do you find, pockets of time to breathe? And I do know from experience that it seems impossible. I mean, I took meditation classes when I was 35, and I have to smile and laugh when I talk about it, because with two young daughters, they were 3 and 5 at the time. And when they went to bed, I had to pick up my computer again and work because I had, deadlines the next day. So sometimes I the only time I could meditate without falling asleep would be when they were awake. And there was something about that, that they would, when they picked up that I was meditating, they wanted to be on my lap. And then I couldn't really, for me back then, that made it harder. So sometimes I actually locked myself in the bathroom to be able to get like 5 minutes on my own. And then they would stand there banging the door. So the thing is, sometimes it's easy to be out of the situation and give advice to people in a situation. And I have a lot of respect for that. So sometimes it's actually like that life can be hard and challenging, and you just have to be in it while it lasts. And do what you can to put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. And if you have a period of time where you have to go on fumes, then be aware of it. I mean, there are a few things that you need to always do. You need to get enough sleep. You need to drink enough water. You need to have intake of energy, like food. Some people have a need to exercise their bodies. We all do, but yes. I mean, some need to run. I never had that need, but I needed to play really, 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 really loud music in my car, for instance. That sort of blew my brain away. My work life was like blown out of my brain if I listened to high. I'm sure I have deteriorated hearing from that time in my life. So, I mean, whatever it is for you, go and do that, but do it. And my car was my sanctuary at that time. So yeah, find your thing.
Yeah, working with a lot of, younger women, also young professional women. It's just that, in Norwegian, you have it called flink. It's being the perfect woman, kind of being the perfect mom, perfect boss, perfect colleague, perfect friend. I think at some point, it's easier said than done. Sometimes you just have to stop giving a shit for everything. I think you need a thicker skin. And again, that is so hard for a lot of people to pick up. But as you said, it's learning from your experiences and adapting from those experiences.
But then you need to go get the experiences, right?
Yeah.
So that is also one thing I think is a gem, because sometimes if you don't seek discomfort, you will avoid it, and then you will not learn anything new. And maybe my toughest pivot in my career was when I knew that my time in Dynamo, that I had loved and learned a lot from, and also had challenging times in, I knew it was over. After 10 years, my whole being just was like, I want to get out of here. My work here is done. They're good without me now, and I want to move on. But I did not see to what and to where. So I felt like I had to leave, and I didn't know where to go. I felt I was stepping out into a black void. that was, and it sounds maybe strange, but I can tell you, I've never been so afraid in my life, because yeah, I had a huge mortgage by myself, and there was still a financial crisis, and I had the home of my dreams. I did not want to let it go. And it's like everything became like this. I'm going to lose everything. I will lose every safety that I've built up. If I don't stay here, I will lose everything I have. It's completely irrational, but that was the story I was telling myself. And I got a job offer from a really nice consultancy firm, but I felt it was wrong for me to do it. And my integrity by then was high enough to not do something that I didn't want to do just for the safety of it, even though I hadn't formulated, seek discomfort and keep expanding yet. I there is this poem by this poet Karin Boye, which is really famous, and it's called Ja visst gör det ont. It's about raindrops or drops falling off of leaves of flowers, and how the drops are telling their story, how afraid they are to fall. And I felt like that. And I remember actually the second where I was so afraid that the feeling of fear broke. It's like I felt like I passed through the emotion and I came to the other side, and I wasn't afraid anymore, because what I was afraid of had sort of already happened anyway, if I thought about it, And so I have that experience now, how what you were afraid of is just a story. The feeling is just a feeling. It's not real. It's just like chemicals in your body.
Exactly.
You can deal with any situation. So it shouldn't prevent you from seeking out dreams or trying new things. But if we rewind to what we spoke about in the beginning, get some sort of support system around you if you need to have something more than yourself, and ask for support. Seek environments where you get the support you need.
I think that's so important what you're saying. The fear can seem so real, so visceral, so that it will send you in pain with the thoughts and the emotions. But as you said, it's like putting on VR goggles, and all of a sudden you see another world. But you take off those VR goggles, then you see the clarity. And as you said, once you pass through the fear, a certain constructive, positive, optimistic state, and you kind of embrace the fear almost, it sounds like, to move forward.
Yeah, but absolutely. And I'm sure many people listening to your podcast have had personal crisis. Maybe even they have lost a loved one. Maybe they have been really, really ill or sick and has recovered. I have a very close friend who had a stroke at 39. He was a top athlete and he had a stroke. And he is, he's joy for life. And he's like, what are you worrying about? If I get a worry look or, worry about something, he's like, come on. So I think when you have experienced real hardship, you know what I'm talking about. It's like, it's already happened and you're still here. And take my word for it, if you haven't had something bad happen to you, we all know we're going to die, but I didn't die yet. And I experienced all of this, and I'm still here. So let's go on living and learning new things and inspire people around you to learn from your experience if they are wise enough to do that, which I think young people today basically are. I believe every generation grows a little bit wiser. So thank God for that.
At least that's what we should hope. Yeah.
No, I think I believe so. I believe so. So I think it's a huge, an important topic that I wish I would have learned earlier. That feelings are chemical reactions in the body, and not something you should live your life by.
The brain's an amazing pharmacy. It'll produce whatever chemicals you want, but that's driven by your thoughts. And as you said, if you can be self-aware of the thoughts of what you're telling yourself, and as you said, to seek discomfort and to keep expanding, then you'll get all those good chemicals or that good chemical recipe that will make that virtual reality that those emotions create in your internal environment a much better place. And as you said, once you stepped into the void, it seemed all black. But when you come through that, it's kind of a tunnel and you kind of come out on the other side. I remember a client, she told me last summer she got her certificate for sailing or whatever, the license, and a sailboat. And she sailed and sailed and sailed along the Norwegian coast. But at some point, she had to go out. And the most frightful thing for her is when she lost sight of land. Right. I mean, she had all the electronics and logically she knew she was safe, but that emotional visual anchor of, oh, there's land. I just have to turn the sails and I'm back. But once you're outside, I've never experienced that. I'm not a sailor, but I can understand that. Wow. Because that's kind of the picture that came to my mind when you said you stepped into the void, right? There's nothing else to anchor on. You're just out there floating, right? Now what? Well, Anniken, we've spent a lot of time. I'm very thankful for the generosity of time. Is there anything that you'd like to share or any last point of advice you'd like to give?
Well, the last thing I want to say in connection to this, what you just mentioned, is that, my mantra has been keep expanding and seek discomfort, but it's personal. Everyone needs to find their own goals, visions for what they want to achieve. And for someone, their mantras would be the exact opposite, maybe. It depends on your starting point and where you want to go. The point is just, living actively and being conscious about, where, what you want to explore and achieve. And I want to end up with just reminding of what you said earlier about self-compassion. I think that if you are able to have self-compassion, and put that together with setting goals for yourself and telling yourself compassionate stories or stories that will make you more resilient, that is the way to go. And the job is figuring out what's, call it mantras. What should your mantra be? What should your goal be? That's some of the most interesting journeys I've had, I must say. So that is part of my passion and also part of what I think, if you're leading a team or a company and you want to have a resilient team, of course, psychological safety is really, at the core of that. But you also need to push the boundaries a little bit. And what it looks like will be different from person to person.
It's a tailored, bespoke approach. I totally concur. Well, Anniken, thank you very much for spending some time with me today on It's Inside Job. I really appreciate you sharing your stories, your experiences.
Thank you for having me, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
Well, folks, that was the amazing Anniken Fjelberg. She is one of the co-founders of one of Norway's largest tech hubs, 657 Oslo. And she is also the director and founder of the consultancy Identio. What I found most intriguing was Anniken's philosophy of leaning in. And in essence, that is learning to trust yourself. And that trust comes from experience. It comes from learning how you deal with success, how you deal with failure and flops and mishaps. It's about moving from a scarcity mindset into an abundance mindset to understand that there are no limits. And that if we look hard enough and if we seek hard enough, that there will be opportunities, that will be possibilities on the horizon. And as Anniken said, her mantra, her mind talk is keep expanding, seek discomfort. And also, as Anniken said, these may not be statements that work for you. And that means for each of us, we have to find a narrative, a story, to ascribe a meaning that works for us, that builds us instead of tears us down, that feeds us with self-confidence and self-compassion instead of self-flagellation, self-doubt, and self-criticism. And Anniken, I'd like to send you a personal thank you for sharing your vulnerability, your experience, and knowledge with us today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure my listeners learned a lot. If any of you are interested in contacting Anniken Fjelberg, I will leave all her contact information in the show notes, as well as the links to Identio and 657 Oslo, the tech hub. And so, folks, that brings us to a tail end of another episode. I will see you next week where we will continue this conversation, where we will build resilience one episode at a time. And until then, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.